Well, hello, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price, and I'm your host. And happy Mother's Day today. And it just so happens that I have an interview with an incredible mother. And we'll get into her book in a second. But I want to introduce Deborah DEEP Mouton, and then we'll get to some housekeeping details and get started with the episode. So I'll read a bit from her bio. Deborah DEEP Mouton is an internationally known poet, singer, actress, photographer, wife, mother, and the first Black poet laureate for the city of Houston. Heralded as a literary genius by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, this California native was formerly ranked the #2 best female poet in the world. Deep has established herself as a notable force in the performance and literary world. Currently, she is a resident artist at the American Lyric Theater's Composer and Librettist Development Program and Rice University through the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. She self-published her first collection of poetry, Heartstrings and Lamentations, at the tender age of 19 while studying English at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her university years helped foster a love for writing that was noticed early on by her high school English teacher. After being introduced to Poetry Slam in high school, she knew she wanted to focus on refining her voice as a poet. After falling in love with the national poetry scene, she moved to Houston, became a member of the 2007 Houston Poetry Slam team, and this goes on and on with incredible accomplishments. She's an amazing human being, but notably, this recent release, in this long bio, her second book, Black Chameleon, published by Henry Holt and Company, debuts in the spring of 2023. This stirring new memoir combines new mythology and with powerful lyricism. This is her book, and I show it in the interview, Black Chameleon, Deborah DEEP Mouton. It's a lovely read. I was weeping within the first 10 minutes. So Deep, thanks for contributing your process here to my project. This is the second interview. I interviewed her back in the 30s, episode number 34 or 44, I forget. And she's become a friend, and I really enjoy her work. So thank you, Deep, for participating. Okay, on to a couple other things. I want to let you know that these podcasts, The Sacred Speak, is sponsored by the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. It's a boutique integrative practice that my wife, Leela Scott Price, and I started, and we are growing. So check us out at the Center, TheCenterForHas, thecenterforhas.com. Check it out. Also, check out the Young Center, younghouston.org. I've got a class coming up 4 Wednesdays, June 7th through 28th, 6 to 7:30. And it is, join us for an illuminating exploration of myth, religion, and the burgeoning field of psychedelic-assisted therapies. Delving into the myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, we will engage the idea that healing power of psychedelics must be approached with reverence, mindfulness, and respect for their sacred nature. Drawing on Carl Jung's groundbreaking insights into the human psyche, as well as contemporary research on psychedelic substance and the mystical experiences that they can evoke, we will investigate the importance of integrating sacred and religious paradigms into the psychedelic-assisted therapies. Together, we will engage in thought-provoking discussions and activities that will help us understand the role of psychedelics in modern spirituality and mental health, and embark on a journey to discover the profound insights and transformative powers hidden within the Promethean myth and the world of psychedelic-assisted therapies. So come and check that out. Again, check out younghouston.org, and you can reach the link to the class. Of course, check out all their classes, too. As always, check out The Sacred Speaks at thesacredspeaks.com. Website out, all kinds of new stuff developing. And check out Modern Nations, modernnationsmusic.com. The full selection of the theme song for the podcast, Clouds, will be played at the end of the episode, so hang out to the end and enjoy the tunes. And I think for now that's it. Nothing else other than really cool episodes coming up. A lot of great work being done, and I can't wait to release next week with Rachel Harris, Swimming in the Sacred, where she interviews 15 psychedelic underground female guides. And it's a wonderful read for anybody looking to understand this material. So thank you for being here. Check out all the material. And for now, we'll leave it there. Happy Mother's Day. Deborah DEEP Mouton, our second time together. I was just looking it up and I said it's episode 45, which must have been like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And so anybody watching and listening, check out that episode. We reviewed one of your previous books of poetry, and still stands out as well. You stand out as an incredible weaver of words, but you deliver so much more than that, and I think that's why you became the spoken word poetry was so powerful when I would watch you deliver your thoughts and ideas and perspectives. But this was different. This book, I want to, you'll have, everybody will have pictures of this. By the way, the cover is fantastic. Who did this?
It is. That was artwork by D.E.E.P Mouton. She's a Texas-based artist and she's phenomenal.
Delete
So
it.
I,
Well, sorry. What do you say?
you know, I'm just like a fangirl about her. I got to do an event with her and I think we were equally as impressed with each other. So we just sat there gushing at each other for like 30 minutes.
What an honor. This is
Yeah.
cool. It's a very cool read. As I told you before, anybody that reads this book, get ready, because I wake up early in the morning and I do my reading, and I didn't realize that I was going to spend my first morning reading your book weeping like a grieving mother, and it ripped my guts out. Um, it's a beautiful story. It is very very hard, as far as like your heart. It draws on your heart. I think it's a story that everybody needs to read. So we're going to go a lot of different places, and I'm just so excited that you're here and that we get to reconnect, and I get to pick your brain and figure out where you are in life. So we'll certainly get to this book. We'll get to your work, but I'd love it for you to introduce yourself to the audience. Let us know what you're up to, and then we'll start diving into this. I'll begin once you do an introduction with what we talked about from antiquity and an argument amongst the gods. But
Yeah.
first, let's just hear from you. Please introduce yourself for everybody.
So my name is Deborah DEEP Mouton. I am a poet, a writer, an author, director, filmmaker, which is kind of new. I've been doing a little bit of that, and librettist, which is a
Yeah.
space that I didn't know I would end up being in so heavily, but I'm super, super excited about the amount of opera I get to write. And so playwright as well. I kind of do anything if it's got words. It's kind of my thing. So I've served as the former poet laureate of the city of Houston, and I'm just excited to be here to talk to you again, John.
I'm excited too. Yeah, and I saw your show at the HGO, Houston Grand Opera. It was Patrick Summers was on from the HGO was on the show, and my wife and I went to see the opera. That's you're doing a lot of beautiful work, Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
It's a pleasure, and it's an honor as an artist, especially during the pandemic. I didn't know if I would be able to keep staging work, if that was going to
yeah.
be the end of my career in that way. So I'm just grateful to be able to still have those opportunities.
Well, so then your modes of expressing yourself really are multiple,
Yeah.
and again, I was saying earlier as we were chatting, one of the things I'm really curious about not only is to dig into your book, of course, because it's fantastic. It's a memoir of sorts with more to it than just a memoir. Um, I don't mean to demean or diminish any
No, no,
memoirs, but
no, I get it.
there's just something else that you can tell that you operate as a kind of shapeshifter, and you can navigate through a lot of different territories, and I really respond to that. But I want to read something that you and I talked about that may get us going, because when I thought about this conversation, I think about how often I'm reading people's work and then talking to them about their work. And what's cool about this conversation is it's kind of a meta conversation. We can not only talk about your work, but we talk about the medium of writing and poetry and that kind of expression. And so as I was thinking about that, this thought came to mind. And it was a reference to a fellow named Walter Hanegraaff, who is a guy I read and then interviewed on the podcast on esotericism and hermeticism. And one of the things that came to mind was a story that he references about the god Amun and Tot, or Tot and Thomas. And so I want to read this really quickly and then see where we go, because what this says is, in the story of Tot and Thomas, Tot, the Egyptian god of knowledge, wisdom, and writing, presents his invention of writing to King Thomas, also known as Amun, the god king of Egypt. Tot believed believes that writing would be a valuable tool for preserving knowledge and aiding memory. However, Thomas disagrees, arguing that writing would not enhance memory, but rather create forgetfulness, as people would rely on written records instead of cultivating their own memories. Thomas also believes that writing would provide the only appearance of wisdom, as readers would be exposed to information without gaining true understanding. And of course, Hanegraaff used this story to exemplify the tension between esoteric knowledge and the role of writing in its transmission. He examines the relationship between esoteric traditions and the written word, as well as broader implications of this relationship on the development and reception of esotericism in Western culture. By analyzing the story of Tot and Thomas, along with other related texts and historical examples, Hanegraaff provides an insightful exploration of intellectual history of esotericism. So the point here, I think, is that what we're talking about is experience and the reporting of that experience and the ways in which the ineffability, right? Because our experience is totally subjective. And then we use these modes of expression to communicate to other people what our experience is. And as an outsider receiving that experience, I am biased because at times I take what's said to me as the experience. It is not the experience. It's a description of the experience. So we can get all into weird conversations about mystical experience and the reporting of mystical experience. But I think that's the real essence of what I want to get with you about, because you have these powerful experiences, and then you also have very powerful ways of communicating that experience. And so I want to talk about the art of writing itself, but also the ways in which you've experienced these experiences and why you expressed them in the way you did. How's that for a setup?
It's a huge setup. I think that it's this really great space to think, especially specifically as a Black woman, to come into understanding the power of writing and the ability of being able to transform people by storytelling.
Yeah.
I think that, as a writer, especially historically speaking, Black people were not given the right to read and to write for quite some time. And so all we had to rely on was kind of the retelling verbally of stories. And I think there's something in that to think about the fact that, those retellings then became the memories, because if we didn't have that, there would be nothing. And it's just leveraging that writing gives us of being able to go back and reach and capture some of those memories that may have been lost along the way. I also think, though, that, memories change every time you remember them. And
Yeah.
so whether it's the experience of actually remembering the experience itself or being told about it, each thing has its own kind of falsehood, its own kind of lack of factual integrity that, falters and fails us. And so I just really feel like they both have their own space and path of being necessary. And we just have to interrogate which one we're trying to glean from.
Yeah, beautiful. How much have you been diving into Black history as, because this, when you and I talked about doing this interview, I was so excited because I lectured this week with my friend and previous podcast participant Robert Hilliker on myths to live by. We were referencing some Joseph Campbell work, and then you were going to come into the office at the center and talk to our team about what you're doing, and then we were going to do the interview. And so I was just like covered up in myth. And so
Yeah.
when you and I chatted about the release of this book, I was just so excited about learning from you and what you did through diving into Black history, but in particular the ways in which these mythologies have woven their tendrils into the current day. So how far back does this go for you as far as looking at Black history and this oral tradition that you're talking about?
Yeah, I have a degree in African American Studies from the University of Michigan. So
Hell
that's
yes.
one of my bachelors. So that's,
You're a good person to talk to here then.
yeah, there definitely is some understanding of Black history from an
Yeah.
academic standpoint that's been a part of who I am, I think, for quite some time. Even before that, my mom was always really big about carrying historical fiction. I realized that in an interview recently, how much historical fiction I read growing up. That was really interesting. That's how I kind of entered into the fiction space.
Hmm.
And so that's always been a love of mine and a passion of mine to dig deeper. I've done the ancestry.com dig craziness that leads you to nowhere.
Yeah.
I'm a researcher and a historian in my own right in that way of wanting to really gather, my own personal history. And so there was a digging that came with that. With this book specifically, though, I spent a lot of time listening, researching, reading to myths, to oral storytelling,
Mm.
digging into kind of the pathways of griots and how that shows up in a lot of various African cultures, thinking about folk tales and the difference between a folk tale and mythology, which I would argue is completely steeped in racism. But that's my own personal beliefs that those two terminologies are quite similar. And sometimes there's a blurred line between where folktale, legend, and mythology lives. And with the mythology being the ones that typically we exalt to a level of deity, and that typically
Mm.
don't come from spaces of people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, there was this kind of deep dive that I did and trying to understand that context before creating these myths because I wanted to know the voice of them. I wanted to know their timbre. I wanted to know what their motivation was. When you look at myth as a genre, what is it seeking to achieve, and how different cultures go about achieving that mark. So definitely there was a deep dive there. And then I think there was a layer that was, if I'm going to create these stories that are deep seated in African American tradition specifically, the diasporic representation of African culture, then there has to be a level of Americanism and there has to be a level of reaching back to some tendrils of African cultures, but in a very generic way, because for so many of us, we don't know what country we landed from.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has to be with the lens of kind of grabbing from the entire continent, instead of having the specificity of a specific culture.
What do you think that does? Not really knowing the origin point.
But yeah, it messes everything up, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I listen to a lot of writer prompts that they give for young kids. And it's like, write about your family tree, write about this person that came before you. And it's like, but what happens when you don't know who that is?
Mm.
When you can only dig back to your great grandmother, or at this point, I think we're three generations, maybe two,
Mm-hmm.
two generations to three generations from the enslaved people. So there's so much I think that becomes lost. For me, the way that I entered into this myth making was to take the sayings of my grandmothers, my mothers, and reverse engineer them into a myth. It was like, if this is the saying I keep hearing in our culture over and over again, when did it start? How did it start? Who said it first? What was the context that made them say this, right? And if I can then create a moment in time that only exists maybe for me to start with, that I could ignite that saying, the oral tradition then pulls forth the mythology, right? We could then unpack it and think about it in that way. And that was difficult at first, but then turned into this very freeing and permissive space that I could own as a Black woman to come in and say, you may have erased mythology from my lineage in this country, but I can rebuild it in the present day. I mean, that's a pretty powerful space to stand in.
Yeah. Well, it's a kind of resurrection.
Yeah.
A lot of mythologies talk about talking to the dead and letting the dead speak. And in so many ways, when you do what you're doing in this book, you're tapping into a current of those who may not be named, but whose essence is interwoven in the patterns of our existence. And so there's a kind of necromancy that's happening where you're letting the dead speak.
No, I mean, I completely agree. There's a story in the book that centers around cicadas and using cicadas as a pathway to kind of an ancestral connection. And I remember writing that story, and then I had just lost a good friend of mine, and my sister had just passed. And I went out in my garden, and I was gardening, and this, like, the chirp of cicadas just started filling the entire garden. And I called my sister's name, and it went quiet, right? And I was like, that's insane. And then the noise like slowly builds up again. And it could be totally coincidental. But I think there's something about like the truth that we believe
Yeah.
kind of like becoming something that's bigger than us. And so then it started to feel really like at home, right? That this sound now is, my sister, my ancestors visiting me and having all of the things to say, right? Even if I don't understand them clearly, there's something really like sound and comforting about the summertime now because of that. And it's shifted the way that I interrogate and kind of work with and live within the environment, of the South. So
Well, and I want to define something, if you don't mind.
yeah,
Do you see me when I go off screen like this? Because am I still in the
I can still
video?
see it.
Okay, good. Because as you're talking about this, I want to read this because this is the way I defined myth in our Lunch and Learn on Wednesday. So I want to see how this matches and what you can critique or add to or expand on. It's about 4 or 5 lines, so hang on. So a myth is a traditional story or narrative that often involves gods, supernatural beings, heroes, or ancestral figures, and attempts to explain the origin, beliefs, or natural phenomena of a culture or society. Myths often carry moral, religious, or philosophical messages and serve to convey cultural values, customs, and histories. Myths are generally rooted, in the oral tradition, which means they were passed down through generations by word of mouth before being written down. They may have elements of symbolism and allegory and can be interpreted in various ways. Although myths often contain elements of fantasy or the supernatural, they are distinct from pure fiction in that they are deeply connected to the belief systems and worldviews of the people who created and passed them down. Some myths are so deeply embedded in cultures that they continue to influence modern beliefs, rituals, and even personal identities. Would you comment on that or expand it a bit?
Yeah, I don't know if I can expand. That's a really great definition. I would add art in your last sentence because I feel
Yeah.
like there's something about the representation of stories in our cultural art scene. I mean, maybe that's in culture, but one of the things I created with this book was I created an art exhibit that went with it where local artists were able to take some of the stories and turn them into two-dimensional artwork.
God, you're doing
It
cool shit.
But and it's up at City Hall right now, through
What?
the end of through mid-April. But it's this thing of, giving students. I worked with the students at Rice University to create their own mythologies, and then those joined mine to go to artists and have those enveloped into kind of some two-dimensional artwork. I'm thinking about, the statues of Venus, right, that we get to see, and that there's something about having that tangible expression of the mythology that does something beyond just the story itself. It
Yeah.
makes it real, it makes it something we can literally touch, right? And so I wanted to start incorporating that into the way that these myths live, that they're not just like a great story on a shelf, but they're also the images you see that recall it back to you. They're, the sculpture you can touch, they're tangible and you can feel them. Even if you're not a black person, you're not a black person in America, right? That there's universality to it, there's truth to it that you can
Oh.
hold close.
Well, and let's go there if we may, because as you know, you go wherever you want to go here, but it would be really cool to have some of these stories populating our conversation.
Yeah.
Of course, I would love for you to start with the first, but if you will go into whatever stories you'd like to, because maybe if we had about three kind of solid myths that you were writing and drawing from, that would be really cool as far as a toehold for us and the listener.
Yeah, it's funny to me. So many people connect with the first myth, which is called "The Women Who Were Blind," because it's the first myth I wrote.
Wow.
So it was the one. It's kind of like my first impulse was to explain how Black women got eyes in the back of their head, and really coming from this space. I think probably all of our moms say this, right? But I heard my mom say it a lot. It was like, "I got eyes in the back of my head, girl. I see everything that you do. Don't try to play me." It was really easy, and I believed it solely as a kid. I was like, she could see everything. I remember my mom. I was walking down the hallway one day, and she was like, "Girl, don't cut your eyes at me." I was like, "How did you see me? We are in two separate rooms, right?" Now as a mom, I completely get that children are wildly predictable,
Yeah.
and that they
Yes.
just do the same thing you did when you were younger, right?
That's right.
It's not really that difficult. But as a kid, I'm like, why does she know me so well? And I wanted to tap into that. But I thought there was also this great commentary about how Black women have been responsible in the political realm so much in society in the last few years. If you've watched the trends, they've been on the voting side of progress, on the voting sides of more liberal views, of spaces to give people more autonomy, right, and identity. And I think that kind of prevailing factor of having to know the pulse of society at all times, being responsible for it, and the responsibility of having to respond to it in a way that moves things along, all kind of tapped into like the mythological eyes that show up across all mythology, uses eyes in some way, shape, or form.
Hmm.
And so I thought it was a great space to start explaining kind of who I am as a Black woman and who the Black women are that came before me. And when I first wrote it, I actually didn't think it was dark. I just was like, to me, it just was honest. I don't know. And the more people read it, I've had such varying responses. You know, you said you cried.
Oh my
A friend of
God.
mine didn't get
I would
past.
not call what I did cry. I wept. it was beautiful. Really, it's a beautiful story.
Thank you.
Hard to get into, but wow, necessary to read.
Yeah, so I wanted to access this idea of mercy. You know, my mom always says, oh, I'm probably gonna mess this up, but she's like, mercy is you not getting the things that you deserve, and grace is you. I don't know. She has a saying, and I'm messing it up terribly. Sorry, mom. But it's kind of this idea that, you know, like it's the sparing of everything that you deserved. And
Mm,
I thought about that kind of as a space for blinding, right? That you can be blind to the things that have come to you, or the things that you feel like you deserve as a person. And so that then turned into the physical blinding of the characters in the story. And I've had people say that it was like start with a horror story, and I was like, I didn't call it horror, but okay. I've had some people who couldn't get past the second page, and then I've had other people who were like, that was my favorite story of the entire collection,
mhm.
or the entire memoir, and it's the one that sticks with me the most. So it's interesting to see how people connect to that kind of idea. That's probably one of the longest myths in the entire book.
Yeah.
And also is probably the most removed from memory in the
Hmm.
ways that some of the other pieces integrate from memory to mythology. Yeah.
Well, it's true. You definitely get that sense that um, there's not that personalistic dynamic. You're really drawing from the kind of, I would say, archetypal patterns of hurt people. The what happens to a subjugated community of people, and what kind of mythologies of redemption, savior dynamic. Like that's the image of the savior, of the hero. Who's our hero? And you just let. Could you share a bit about that story now? Because I would love for folks to know kind of what we're talking about, just so they're not totally left in the.
Yeah, for sure. So I created a character named Fumbe, who is an enslaved person, though I keep slavery very much at the perimeter of the world.
Mm,
And that was a very intentional choice, that I didn't want to just write another slave story, but I wanted to write a story about a community that lives within the enslaved times and
mhm,
has their own identity, because I believe that in so much of Black culture, we did have to create kind of our own community that sits at the edge. She decides that she's going to blind her child in the ritual way that the women of this smaller province do, taking them out on the field or the edge of the field and blinding them in the dark, so that way that they can't be sold off from them, right? The
mm,
kind of damaged goods way out, which is funny because it actually, while this specific story I don't know is real, it's got a lot of truths in it. In that
mhm,
there were quite a few enslaved people who either worked very slowly or injured themselves on purpose in order to stay with their families. And so I wanted to draw into that and maybe just take it to another level. She blinds her daughter. Her daughter then is reintroduced to the world, and she's starting to teach her how to see in a different way, how to feel the ground, how to listen to the world around her and see it. And her daughter stumbles into water and drowns. She's taken it from her, and Fume then decides that she's going to bargain with God, right? That she goes to Yemiya, the deity of water, or Mami Wata, as we know her in African American mythology, this kind of judging water god that for so many people has kind of guarded the middle passage and people as they kind of traverse that really difficult space of history and beg for her daughter back. And she's gifted her back only under one condition, which is that an eel is commanded that tangles around her neck and gives her a second set of eyes. And these eyes can't be plucked out, can't be blinded, and she has to live, and her lineage has to live with two sets of eyes, knowing that they can't turn their eyes from really difficult things in society, but that they have to embrace them fully and whole.
mm. Say more about that last part, knowing that, because that to me is what you were talking about with the political landscape of women, black women in politics.
Yeah, I would love to be ignorant of what's going on in the world,
Hmm.
right? Like, I would love to just put blinders on and like it doesn't affect me. I don't want to do it. I don't know that as a black woman I've ever had that choice. I've always been someone who has had to be tapped in, who people ask me about things and I'm like, I'm supposed to know that. Why am I supposed to know that?
Mm.
There's this kind of expectation that we are the ones who are always with our finger to the pulse of society. And it's a difficult space to wrangle. It's also, a privilege to know that you are trusted in that way, I guess. I question mark around trusted. Uh, but that the expectation is there. I think also that this inability to turn away, I think about the first person who I watched die was in a viral video, right? And had a body with a skin tone like mine and was being trampled by police officers and shot in a train station, Oscar Grant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that there's this desire. I would have loved to turn the video off and to walk away, but in our culture so many people were talking about it and you needed to know and you needed to see, and you needed that as almost fodder to validate the things that you wanted to say. And as a Black person, we have in the last few years watched quite a few people who look just like us be killed in ways that almost become a sense of entertainment. I tap into that a little bit for my first collection, Newsworthy. But I think that specifically Black women hold that in a very different way, in a different space. When it's your husband, when it's your son,
Mm.
watching those things happen, it becomes a part of you in a way that you can't avoid yourself from. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me. I may have said this in our first interview, but Jeff Kripal made a comment about in my very first interview on this podcast. He made a comment about there's a reason why our comedians tend to be Jewish and Black, and we were talking about the value of comedy to express the shadow of the culture, and so there is a unique, and this may be why people lean on maybe of course too much at times lean on Black women in particular, because there is a wisdom, and it's a sad hard-earned wisdom, but there's a perspective there that you do see things. Your eyes are, we could say, larger in a number of ways, because there's something sociologically speaking about being in the community and also out of the community, and being
Yes.
able to know and see the problems with that. It's like when you start dating somebody and they come into your home and they're like, whoa, your family just fucked up like you know you can you can see the dynamics that are invisible to the people within that particular tradition, and that's got to be a very burdensome load to carry.
Yeah, I mean, I also would say that it's also the basis for the community between Black women, right? Is that one Black woman can be across the hall from me and go, and I'm like, I already know, sis. Like, I know what you don't even have to say anything. So there also is this really great unspoken language between us. And when I was approaching even titling this book, Black Chameleon, it was less about the changing colors that people completely associate with chameleons, though I do think that we're adaptable and we do shapeshift quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I started looking into the physical attributes of chameleon. And one of the things is that they have 360 viewpoint, right? That they could
Mm.
see on all sides. And I just felt like that really did tap into how I felt and, about myself as a Black woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wrote something I want to turn back to because I, yeah, you were when you said chameleon, I wrote code switching, and
Yeah.
and it's something that I want to just throw that lobbed ball out there to talk to you about. So what comes up for you when I say that term and we talk about the shapeshifter?
Yeah, I mean, definitely code switching comes up. There's
Mm.
actually a story in here about me working at a call center and the kind
That's
of ability I needed to code switch, which is one of the more humorous stories.
yeah.
I actually almost took it out, and my editor was like, "We need to breathe, right? We just let us let us just breathe. You're giving us a lot of heavy things to think
Wisdom. Yeah.
about. Just let us breathe." But I think that that ability to, turn on the voice and turn it off and be more culturally relevant is definitely something that I feel like, especially millennials and above, had to do much more maybe than,
Mhm.
Zennials and well, I'm a Zennial, but then Generation Z has to do because they've kind of we've laid the foundation that Generation Z gets to be a little bit more of themselves, right?
Mhm.
Just a little bit. Um, and so I think, us being able to like physically alter our sound in spaces for professionalism, for expectation. My mom always says, I can tell when your intelligence is being threatened because you pull out all your $1 million words. right? And she's like, you
Beautiful.
completely display all of your degrees
Here it is.
at the moment
Yeah.
someone promotes you, and I think that's a toolkit. It's definitely like a weapon in the bag of how I protect myself and how I think about who I am in this world. Is like, what side of me do I need to show in order to survive this moment?
Well, and
Um,
this is just to add to this for a second. I had this realization recently when looking at shamanism and certain indigenous practices in South America and beyond, because there tends to be a mythology around the shapeshifter, and through allegory, it I don't need to know about actuals. Does somebody actually turn into a puma?
yeah,
what when I was reading your book, it was like, no, I mean, because I resonate with the shapeshifter. I've got a tattoo of a stick bug on my arm because it's camouflage and it blends in. That is a very adaptive, highly tuned mechanism that we can use. And I'm a white man, and although I grew up in a family system, I'm very conscious of the ways that I can shift and maneuver. And as a psychotherapist, I mean, every hour, boom, 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 new story, new narrative. How am I showing up? This person just suffered the death of their child, and the next hour, there's a person who's freaking out because their kid is making bad grades. So, but on your end of things, I just loved how you put that out in the foreground and how it becomes something beautiful and not something to hide.
yeah.
That your capacity to shapeshift is a strength, and it's hard earned. So speak of that, because that was a good story at the beginning.
What, the call center story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely rooted in the truth. I was working at a call center, which shall remain nameless, in Houston, and we would get these really wild calls because it was a center where we got a lot more rich white people calling in to book travel for some reason.
Hmm.
Um, and a lot of people who worked in the call center were people of color, and that did not sound like people of color. If there is a sound, right? If there is
Hmm.
an exact
Hmm.
sound, but knew exactly how to code switch to be able to be the most accommodating and accessible to people who maybe were more reserved about us. And I remember, being able to turn it in. This is Deborah the operator. How may I direct your call? Right? I could completely turn it on whenever I needed to. And the second it hung up, I was like, girl, let me tell you about this man who called me, right? So I think just like that ability to switch it and to change it, also though led me into a little trouble because as people started to say things that were more racist, right? Started to request things that were more problematic. Where do you draw the line and where your authenticity lives, where it gets to emerge, where you have to keep it quiet for your own safety, or for keeping your job and your professionalism. Those are things that I think always weighed on me, but would always sneak up in spaces and ways that I didn't expect it. Specifically in this story, it's an older Southern woman who calls and says she doesn't want any Black or Spanish agents because she needs people who speak English, right? And it's like, what? um, and so it's thinking of that, of like, how do I show up in a moment where I have all the power to say something that's devastating to this woman, right? I've already proven at this point in the book that my tongue is magical and can rip you to shreds if I needed to. So I have it in there, but it's a question of, am I going to use it at this moment?
Yeah.
And I think that that's the question we constantly have to deal with. My mom and my mom comes up a lot because she's really heavily an influence to this book, but she would constantly tell me, like, you have to be really careful with your tongue because you can
Mm-hmm.
tear a person apart without lifting a hand. Like, you specifically just know how to ruin a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so where something is flippant to you, you have to be the surgeon. You have to really think about how it affects people. And sometimes that's been my greatest weapon. And sometimes that's been where I pull back in and learn to use my silence, and I wanted to show that kind of duality within this piece.
That's not easy for somebody to learn silence who has such a wonderful weapon.
I got in a lot of trouble when I was little.
I'm sure you
So
did.
I had to learn that you can't take words back. And
Yeah.
just because I'm in the moment and I want to say the thing that's devastating to you, maybe I don't need to. I should have put a story in about playing the dozens because it was something that I had to learn how to do as a young child. I had older siblings who constantly would tease me and poke at me because they thought it was the ability to make me stronger. And I had to learn how to verbally defend myself with them, but those skill sets could not be applied at school, even when I tried. Like there was a time and a place for every weapon, you know.
Well, as you're saying that, I'm back to that narrative we were weaving around letting the dead speak, and with your interest in history, in Black history, and myth, what else can you comment on as far as kind of communal orientations and mythologies that exist to support the cohesion of the community? I know church was big in your upbringing.
Yeah.
What about your religious and spiritual life and the certain mythologies that you'd encounter there? What do you say about that?
Yeah, my father was a pastor, was raised in a very Christian household. I denounce the word Christian, though I am a Christ faith centered person, because Christians, they kill people and stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not a fan.
Mm-hmm.
So historically, they have some problems over there, those Christians.
They sure
But
do.
I do believe in Christ, right? And follow the teachings of Christ. And so I think for me, there was also an unpacking of mythology within the Christian context of not just seeing the Bible as a space of spiritual recognition or guidance, but also as its own book that in and of itself is unpacking it as a form of genre, right? And so that's actually, I ended up creating a parable in this book because I was looking at, the Bible as like, what is the vehicle by which that Jesus tells stories and conjures faith and explains the world? And it was like, oh, it's living in these parables. Well, what is it to take, the idea of a parable and reclaim it in African American culture? What do I get to tell? And I ended up stumbling on the parable of the gardeners, which is a story where one gardener grows fear and one gardener grows faith. And they have to, I'm sorry, one gardener grows hope and one gardener grows fear. And they have to figure out what the implications of growing those two crops do and how they live in a world where they both exist. And there was a like kind of a stumbling in where I was like, is this too simple? It feels like parables are really simple,
Mm-hmm.
but are wildly complicated underneath them. And I don't know if I'm really being as effective as I want to be. But I had to kind of like lean into it and just say, and I tell people a lot of times haiku. So thinking about poetry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Haiku is the idea of placing two items next to each other on a table and allowing your reader to make connections in its traditional forms. And so I think in a parable, the same way, it's placing ideas in front of you, a story in front of you, and allowing you to make the implications and connections of how you apply that to your own current understanding. And so, leaning into that kind of poetic lens, I decided to include the story. And since then, I've heard quite a few people have feedback about the story that they really resonated with it and that they're able to take it and apply it. So I feel like it was somewhat successful. I don't know. We'll see.
No, the one point I thought it was very successful. I enjoyed that story. The point though that's interesting here is that you're writing these, you're creating these, but you're also connecting them to what? I mean, what are the mythologies that you heard with a religious centered home, with a community? Like what were the myths of your early life?
I mean, definitely, it was the teachings of Jesus. You think about the parable of the fig tree. You think about even the parable of the sower, right? And the parable of sower, funnily, I say that one because it's both this kind of idea of sowing seeds in the Bible and also this call to Octavia Butler's books, right? The parable of the sower, where she recreates that as an alternate world where in Afrofuturism. So there's this bridge of,
Hmm.
that these parables have even lived in the future already in writers' minds, and we're bridging the gap between them. I think it's great because for me, I love Afrofuturism so much, but I wonder, if we lean towards the future because we don't have the permission to go back and to rectify the past. And so I wanted to shift the lens from being that I don't want to have to write a world that hasn't existed yet, but that I want to write about a world that did exist that we are not allowed to talk about. And so definitely those things were in my early life. The folk tales or myths around Anansi were huge for me. I remember my mom having this big storybook of Denzel Washington reading Anansi in a very African accent. That's you can't place as one country over another. I don't know. It was now looking back at it, I'm like that was a little problematic. But in the moment, it was what I needed. I needed to hear a voice that sounded like a culture. I needed to connect that to an idea of a story. And I played that tape until the physical ribbon fell out of the cassette tape, and then I wound it back up with the pencil and played it again, right? And so I think there's always been this kind of desire of me to understand it. I also really love Roman and Greek mythology. Like, just because I kind of like downplayed in the book doesn't mean that I don't have a connection to it.
Yeah.
Specifically, Medusa, which is a character that my daughter is wildly in love with. And historically, for some reason, is the myth of Roman and Greek mythology that Black people have claimed and been like, Medusa really had dreadlocks. Medusa was really a Black woman. She was wildly
Oh,
misunderstood.
yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that there's that
Huh.
finding yourself within a story that you don't exist in for the sake of giving yourself identity and room and space. And it's like, well, if we can do that, then we also can just create the myths ourselves, you know?
I think this point is so important, and by the time this episode comes out, there are two others that will be before it. But I posted an interview this past Sunday with Jeff Kripal on his book, The Super Humanities. Now, this is a book you should read. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. Jeff, Jeff is essentially saying he's using Black critical theory, psychoanalytic theory, feminism, post colonialism, and an ecological humanistic tradition that where he's saying our religious traditions are, because if I could borrow from him, he says, look, I grew up Catholic, and there's no way to avoid the gendered, racist um, belief systems that are baked into the narratives. And so he's advocating for a new story. I mean, and he's saying that it's we don't need to mine tradition. We need to write our new religious myths. To because if we just try to dig in or revive what came before us, we're still going to have the same problems. So I'm really loving this connection with what you're doing, what you're actively living out in your life, and what he's advocating for on an academic level. That you're writing new mythologies based upon your personal experiences to help give life to these patterns that exist in not only your upbringing, the Black community, but all of us. Like that's the power of these myths, is that they are transcultural on some level. They communicate deep realities that we need to look at, and there's no reason why um, I why I would say, like, Black religion, African religion, can't provide us an inroad into a fusion between all the cultural traditions where we can start to, like, let the dead speak, but also let the dead speak in modern tongue.
Yeah. Yeah,
Thoughts?
I agree. My daughter, she kind of hit me with this same kind of sentiment. We were doing like an at-home Bible study, and I was teaching her about the Holy Trinity, and I was like, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And she's like, Mom, where's the daughter and the mom?
Oh, amen.
And I was like,
Oh,
oh,
damn, it ain't up
right.
there. Yeah.
you know,
Oh,
and I was like, it was this thing where I was like, I have to give you something else.
yes.
Yes, it's great to read about Ruth and Esther, right, and even Deborah, right, in the Bible. It's great to have Mary, the one person that we
The
herald as,
one. Yeah, marry the one. Thank God.
right. But there has to be more than that.
Yeah.
You have to have something. And then as a Black girl, who do you look upon, right? When every passage is wielded against you in a way, when the Bible is used as this weapon against you as a Black woman, as this sin and this person who needs to be persecuted, and slaves obey your masters. And, there's this other tradition that's where we see, that kind of problematic Christian that I talk about come up that uses it in a very different way in America, maybe than it's used in other spaces, as not only just a religious text, but as a political tool
Mm-hmm.
to oppress people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how do you write around that? I don't know, but I'm trying.
Well, so let's go back into your history. You were the daughter. How did that influence you and impact you when you didn't see yourself reflected in some of those stories?
I mean, I think it's the work of Black readers, and it has been for so long that we read works where we're not centered and we find ourselves somewhere in them, right? It is like the way that we go about reading text is I'm going to read this book, and I know that there's not going to be anyone who looks like me, but I'm going to find a character who I identify with in some other way. At least good writing does that, right? Gives us a pathway that it doesn't matter what culture you come from because you can see some tenets of yourself. We're all
Yeah.
human. I should find something. It's different though to find a character who looks like you, who sounds like you, who speaks like you, who brushes her braids over her hair, and who just has the vernacular that you speak in. It's just a different level of identity. I was speaking at a event at Rice recently, and I said, "There's this whole campaign. If you see her, you can be her." I have problems with that because so many of us can't see people who look like us
Hmm.
still represented. I think a better way to go about that is if you could imagine her, you could be her. That there's something in us that has to be able to
Hmm.
see the things that are not there in order to propel us into a space that we've never been before. And so I think, growing up, there was definitely that. It was, seeing pictures. My mom had pictures of a black Nefertiti as a black woman next to Cleopatra as a black woman. And those were things that were visible in my home. And so I think, she was very big on like Egypt is part of Africa. Don't let them do
Hmm.
that. Right. Don't let them take it away. And even as a teacher, I remember having to teach world studies, and they literally had me teach Egypt 3 weeks after Africa, right, in the Middle Eastern unit. And it
Hmm.
was like, I'm not allowed to access that as a black woman either. So it has been a lifelong journey of mine to figure out how to represent us again. Walter Mosley has this great quote: if you're not in the literature of a country, then you're not in their history. And I've held that really close as kind of my charge. It's like, as a writer, if I have any power, if I have any leverage, it is to make us unerasable in American, literature, and by which solidifying our existence in the American historical, framework. Now, that's a big ask for one little writer to do. I realize that I only have a certain amount of influence in that, but whatever influence I have, I'm going to try to use it.
Those are big ideas.
Yeah.
It does make me wonder about Black critical theory and what we're losing out on by not allowing for those voices to speak, given that it's such an important narrative in the
Oh yeah.
entirety of our culture. Jeff's point is that we've been teaching Black theory for a long, long time. Like, why is it all of a sudden it's bringing so much controversy? What are
I
your
mean,
thoughts on this?
the reality is black theory is American history
Yeah.
at its purest form, right? Who built this country? Physically built it, and those are the people who are not allowed to tell you how they did it. That makes no sense,
None.
right? You ban the books that represent us because you don't like how you're represented in them.
Mm-hmm.
Why not teach students how to make their own assumptions and
Mm-hmm.
understanding, right? We're given as teachers this Bloom's taxonomy hierarchy that's supposed to have children engage in synthesizing and analyzing at the toppest, at its best performance, right? But then we literally subvert that by giving them the exact opposite of that as entry points into education. It, I don't understand it. It's very confusing to me. And as book bannings, especially here in Texas, have begun to take root, it's this question of like, what are we doing? I'm very confused.
It doesn't make any sense. I tell you, my Leila Scott, my wife and I went to Boston, and we did this amazing tour. It was the Freedom Trail. It was this kind of walking tour, and we had this amazing docent who we were talking about all the statues and all the figures that we're learning about, and she did a fantastic job of saying, "Hey, let's not take these statues down, but let's talk about the reality of what was happening. Let's let them remind us of the ways in which these narratives are not actually true." And she gave the example of Paul Revere, and she said, "Let's talk about Paul Revere and his story." Oh, you know it. I
Go ahead,
was
share for the people, John.
I was I was blown away, Deep. Paul Revere, like nothing I knew about Paul Revere was true. And it was a propaganda narrative that was supporting a particular agenda. And if that doesn't piss you off, then you're not paying attention. And so, we have these belief patterns that are centered on these false ideas that support an illusion because this guy was on the run.
I mean, this guy was like fleeing, and he was actually the guy that implicated everybody else. He snitches get stitches. This bitch was snitching. So I've got to say, I,
Yeah.
so just that example. I mean, I was so pleased to know that there's somebody, this docent again, who is amazing, that's educated, who is not saying take it down, who is saying no, let's let this interrogate us. And I think that's the one of the points is that my projection onto a lot of one minuscule projection is that on a lot of Black theory, there's an interrogation that necessitates keeping your eyes open. To your point, whereas so many of us who are not as conscious and not willing to withstand the tension of dealing with the beliefs that I have and the reality that exists. And rather than just writing that off, holding that tension and sitting there in the discomfort and saying, I have some work to do here. I have some work to do of reconciling these differences. And I for one, really like that opportunity to do the heavy lifting of feeling that anxiety and going, oh, fuck, my mind is blown. Like, now I got to figure out how I pick up the pieces. But that's just one small example of an entire tome that exists of misinformation.
Yeah. People were like, I've had people ask me with this book specifically, why did I specify that it was a Black American mythology and
Mm.
not just Black mythology? And I think part of that is rooted in, I believe, American mythology is revisionist history, right? It is us taking, revising our best bet, spitting
Not
them
bad.
back out.
Yeah.
I was reading recently Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech and stumbled upon a link that was like, here is the original versus here is the one that is propagated in textbooks.
Right.
And that there's two versions. One is very articulate and the other is broken into African American vernacular English in ways that white people
That
associate
pisses
with.
me off.
Right. And so what we have learned is a very different version of a speech that a woman gave that was wildly powerful, but they could only take it in a certain package. And as
Mm.
I've dug into even like Susan B. Anthony,
Mm.
recently I was talking to a friend and she's like, Susan B. Anthony wasn't at Seneca Falls, right? And she wasn't even there. It for me it's this thing of like we revise the history to give the best
Mm.
possible American story. We get George Washington and his apple. We get these things that sound like really great things to hold on to, but they're so devoid of what really happened because the color of that would have to be so much more honest, and we're not willing to interrogate that. And so, in coming to this myth, it's the reason why I approached the memoir pieces the way that I did in this story. There's a scene where I'm 10 years old and this guy like heckles me in the middle of a fast food restaurant. And that story could have ended with me being a crushed child, who was devastated and who doubted her body for the rest of her life and was had weight issues and had all of these other things because of that moment along with others and other things, but that was kind of the start of it. Or I could enter it as the revisionist American,
Wow. Yeah.
and I could revise that story to give me a powerful wielding dragon of a monster that I fight in the middle of the fast food restaurant and I chop his head off with this giant knife of a finger, right? Like what better way to end the story, right? Than is like this victorious, like slicing his head off, right? And so it was like this thing of if American history is this revisionist space of storytelling, how much more do I, as a Black woman, get to
Mm.
tap into that and revise even my own understanding of my own experiences? And isn't that, at its heart, the most American thing that I could do?
I say you're in service to something broader and more expansive because an apple narrative comes up as you say that, and of course I immediately went to the Genesis myth and thinking through, number one, it said fruit, not apple, but that's
You
beside
did.
the point. So that narrative seems to serve a way to articulate deep, irrepresentable truths about the cosmos and about creation and about humanity. So I get that allegorized dynamic that shows up when we're trying to represent the irrepresentable,
Yeah.
these mysteries of existence. But the another mode of myth, as we were talking about earlier, is the social function. And so
Mhm.
what you're talking about is really powerful because the ways that these they're really propaganda myth. They're trying to shape and shift realities in service to an ideological narrative that seemingly empowers a base community, but has nothing to do with the truth of the experience. And those are two very different motivations for myth. But
Yeah.
and what you're talking about is actually giving life to these forces that you've experienced in allegory, in the same way that what they would do to comic books
Yep.
or other dynamics that help us relate to these social and cultural dynamics, but aren't saying that this is truth. They're
Yeah.
saying that this is a truth of a deeper level. It's not some historical truth, even though there are threads of historical truth, as you said earlier about the wounding of bodies to prevent separation of family. I mean,
Yeah.
that makes my heart stop. I don't know what else
Yeah.
to say about that. I'm just kind of that this thread on you said it earlier where and I wanted to circle back to this when you were referencing the word folk, so
Mhm.
mythology and folk tradition. And I must say there are times when I've talked about black folk tradition and in one particular context, and I want you to bump up against this and tell me why it's wrong, is um, there's a syncretistic religious tradition from South America called the Santo Daime, and I interviewed a fellow who's a professor of mysticism at SMU. He wrote a book called Liquid Light, and he talks about the Santo Daime, and essentially this religious tradition is a fusion of, here's the line, of Catholicism, of indigenous South American native traditions, and black folk traditions, because you had these three communities that were slammed together in, one invaded, the Catholic folks invaded. But
Mhm.
what happened when the slaves came over to South America? They fled and ran into the forest. And there was this like intermingling of the indigenous folks and then the folks that were brought over. And of course, that overriding narrative of Christ. So tell me more about how that word folk is used not to empower but to reduce.
I mean, so my first experiences of Black American folklore were, I'll give you kind of three examples: Brer Bear, Brer Fox, and the People Who Could Fly. Right? Brer Bear and Brer Fox obviously leaning to anthropomorphism, right? Of
Yeah,
taking these characters and developing them. Also completely written by a white man, which that's not to reduce it, but is also to say that the person's outside the culture writing about the
that's right.
culture. There's a level of authenticity that gets lost there, right?
Yes.
And then Virginia Hamilton's The People Who Can Fly, which in this story, enslaved people decide to rise up against their master and instead of fighting back, literally take to flight, flying back to Africa and leaving everything behind because they're like, we're done with it.
I'm sure. Yes.
There's this small line that talks about that there's some that are left behind,
Mm.
right? Um, but what kind of character gets to take flight? That doesn't sound to me like a folklore. That
Hmm.
sounds to me like a level of deity, right? That sounds
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
something supernatural that,
Supernatural. Yeah.
but it is not acknowledged in any way as African American mythology because it
Aha.
lives, right? There's this
Huh.
dissonance about that if it lives with us, if it comes from us, if it's birthed among the people, that somehow has a level that's less than being the space of an Athena or a Poseidon, or these other characters, right, that we have lived. Which some of them were just the god of war. What does that
Hmm.
mean? You just started a lot of fights. There's not really there's not really a supernatural tendency to that. You just don't know how to stop picking fights. And so, you launched 1,000 ships. What does that mean? You looked over and the army was leaving. I mean, come on now. What is the supernatural force? But for some reason, yours is considered mythology and mine is considered folklore. And somehow folklore is less trustworthy.
No, I get that, and I will say that the way I use it, to me, it feels more real. I don't know. It feels more like I'm sitting around passing stories, down the line and the lineage around the fire. Like
Yeah.
folklore to me is that kind of earth, as opposed to
Mhm.
mythology has a kind of, but that's right. I totally get what you're talking about. That there's a kind of diminishment when we talk about folklore, because whether we're doing that in the pantheon with 3,000 people or 6 people around the fire, the the purpose that it serves is similar. I want to read something that you've inspired. You're inspiring me a lot, Deep, as you do. There's this guy named Carl Ruck, who's a professor of classics at Boston University, and he's got a list of 14 ways that myth expresses and presents the value of the individual and the collective. And myths, I forget this book. I'll reference it at some point. Look below. But the first out of 14, the first two the ideas of what myth does or how it serves us. He says number one, myth is what we call somebody else's reality. Our own myths we call reality. And that sometimes makes a little pin drop. That
Yeah.
that unfortunately, and I think this is something kind of cool, that when you are outside of a dominant tradition, you're able to reflect on the um, the transient nature, right? I mean, the myth isn't of solid state. It's very true, but it's not measurable and identifiable. Yet you can see it, as we were saying earlier. But then you also can see the fact that you will hold lightly your own myths and not turn them into concrete reductions so that you become a kind of zealot or a fundamentalist. That if you can see the nature of the mythic function in our psyche, you start to recognize that it points towards something that's irrepresentable. And you don't make the mistake of saying, no, this is an actual historic truth, rather than concealing deep, powerful knowledge that we need to transmit from generation to generation. What does this idea bring up for you around myth and reality?
I, it's such a blurred line. I talk about Boo Boo the Fool in the book, and I think about the universe, like that phrase, that person is referred to across all Black culture, and no one knows who they are. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it
Mm-hmm.
is just your
Mm-hmm.
mom being like, "I'm not Boo Boo the Fool. I don't know why you think he was gonna come at me." No one knows who Boo Boo the Fool is, who what women said that first, who they were talking about. You know that there's something that is there as that universal truth that we are all accepting, that there is an archetype of a person that your mother is not, that is foolish, that
Mm-hmm.
is reckless, that doesn't understand boundaries, right? That is easily deceived. Like all of these things are compact in one name, even if we don't have a story to go along with it. To me, that checks every box of myth
Yeah.
that's lined up,
Yeah.
right? Though we don't see it as that because
Right.
one, we may not have the story. Two, because it's so intracultural for us that other people don't accept it as their social truth, that we can't elevate it to the space of myth. It just lives as folklore. Or it just lives like not even folklore, as colloquialism, right? Like it then
Uh-huh.
becomes reduced to just colloquialism, which feels more fleeting even than folklore does. And so I think there's just this line that we have to interrogate. Whether or not you agree with me or not, you don't have to. But I do think it's worth the conversation of thinking about what is the language, the diction we're using to talk about the differences between these fundamental bases of understanding that give context to how my life thrives and moves versus how yours does. Right? That at some level is mythology for Black people, whether or
Mm-hmm.
not you agree with it. I don't agree with that there's a Poseidon, right, that's somewhere casting the water forth, but I don't have to agree with it for it to still be considered mythology and acknowledged as such. At what point in time do Black Americans get that space of having a canon of their own, right? Where is that allowed?
Well, let me put that question back to you. Where is it allowed?
Where we make it, right? I think that was one of the prevailing factors for me as I was writing this book. There was a part of me that's like, you are born and raised in the church. Writing new gods seems like heathenism, right? Like blasphemy. What are you doing? Playing in this space, you're going to hell. And then there was a space that's like, no, it's reclaiming. It's, it's reclamation. It's
Yeah.
resurrection in some ways. It's
Yeah.
cataloging. It's
Yeah.
canonizing this feeling, this, this just straight pathos that you have felt your whole life. This ethos that you felt your whole life, that's guided you in ways that you cannot explain. And it's saying, I'm going to put a name to it, a shape to it, a story to it. I'm going to put it in its own library and allow it to live beyond me, so that when we're talking about it as a larger cultural group, even outside of Black culture, there's something we can point to that gives us that same space of leveraging. Kind of coming back to that
Mm.
first thing that we were talking about around writing versus, this authenticity of experiences. What happens when the people no longer speak of the experience and the experience is no longer around to be lived? Then there has to be some middle ground. There has to be some bridge that brings the experience back to the memory of the people. And I think that that's the beautiful space that writing plays, right? Of being able to say in 50 years, when, my daughter is a grown up and I'm probably not even here anymore, or I'm very
Mm.
old in age and I'm not, maybe as clear as I want to be, unless I'm like my grandmama, who's like, I think she's going to die a prophet, right? Um, like, what is it that how the world has changed, and she now can see how I interrogated the world and how those principles can be applied to her life, even if the world around her is riddled with climate change, right? And
Mm.
is politically a very different landscape. And, for all we know, cars are flying according to sci-fi, right?
Mm.
What happens when the literal world around you changes, but the experiences still need to be there? Writing does that for us.
Side note: is your grandmother still alive?
She is. So I
Is
have
it?
one grandma.
This is Ida May, right?
No, so Ida Mae is not with us anymore. She's an ancestor. Gma is still with us. And my grandmother passed away as well a few years ago. So I talk about Gma and grandma because
Mm-hmm.
I separate those. My Gma is G, right? She's the prophet. She's gonna lay it down. She gonna get you right. And she's
Talk to me
very,
about that for a second. What you call her a prophet?
yeah, I
Say
mean,
more.
one, she's literally an evangelist, right? Like, there's that part that's like the religious designation.
Yeah.
But I think also she is the truth teller. She
Mm.
is very much the matriarch of our family, very much the barometer of wisdom. Like, those things are all things that I feel like she holds. You know, I see prophets as being people who not only understand the world in a very unique perspective, and there's a certain kind of future truth telling, but also people who are unapologetic
Mm-hmm.
about the beliefs they have, whether they're right or wrong. They are unapologetically full 10 toes down on what they believe. And I would argue at every turn, my grandmother is that person, right? Who is going to say, she'll say, I'm 89 years old. Can't nobody tell me nothing. I know this world. She's lived here long enough. She has a perspective. And I think it's definitely something I've drawn strength from. And she gets on my nerves sometimes. I love you, Grandma. But
Of course.
it's that thing of, I think she sees the world in a very clear way, and it's informed by her experiences, which can both be a detriment and a blessing, and is able to guide us, hopefully, away from the harsher things that she's, exhibited, and towards maybe some of the lights that she's found.
Well, you're hitting on an experience of something that you were talking about with this early story that I read. That Jima is steeped in her own experience,
Oh yeah.
and so looking at writing is what you're saying, that there are a number of people who read the experience of others and have those experiences, but don't have experiences and write about those experiences. And that's the kind of meta orientation that's so wonderful about what you're doing, is that you're mining an ancient tradition of mythologizing and reporting on aspects of nature and the cosmos and personal experience that can be um, housed in a linguistic form that is representable to other people. So you're doing the work of mining and excavating the experiential nature of reality and putting it into a form that's communicatable to other people. It reminds me of this. Joseph Campbell said something about the four functions that myth serves as mystical or religious, cosmological, sociological, and psychological. and
Mm.
how often the levels that we're talking about, like not only the religious nature. I mean, why are we here? Where have we come from, and where are we going? But also the sociological function of how a culture exists and what it needs to know, how the mythology encapsulates knowledge of how to exist in a particular culture. And that's something that I think is really powerful in what you were mining in your book, is that you're a girl growing up in a world that you don't see yourself reflected in as much, and learning very quickly from these mythic frameworks that are passed on. And so you're such a fantastic intermediary to talk about this. I'm so blown away that myth is right at the foreground of my life right now, and we happen to schedule this interview this week.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it all works together. It's
It's
out of,
totally cool.
you know.
Yeah, no, it is. It's totally cool. Um, okay, so we've covered the Black critical theory, which I think is we can go into a whole lot more if. Um, but there is something that I want to mine into about your womanhood. You know, I have a good friend of mine I was talking to once, and he's a beautiful black man who's a gay man, and we were talking about his lived experience, and he said he said to me at one point he was walking down the road and he could tell that the person in the car that was parked on the road locked the car doors. And he said to he was like, I don't know if they're doing that because of my I'm a man, I'm a black man, or I'm a gay man.
Hmm.
And to think in terms of what are they seeing of me, that takes you out of your present moment awareness, because all of a sudden you're seeing yourself reflected in a threatening way. And so I just want to see what that stirs up for you and what we can talk about
Yeah,
womanhood.
like I'm immediately drawn to one of the stories in the book,
Mm-hmm.
where I talk about fighting this girl in middle school because she calls me a nigger because she shouldn't have called me a nigger. And in the principal's office, she says that I called her a bitch. And from that, the principal then is like, that's not language we use for women. I completely get reamed. I'm punished. She's never handled for the racism, but I
Wow.
am definitely handled for speaking against her womanness as if
Mm-hmm.
I don't have, you know. I think that there is this really weird line between being black and being woman, that we tread. And, I was thinking about, I'm working on a piece that's about Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass and their friendship. And as we were thinking about expanding the story, we started thinking about who are the other people who have really high stakes in their success. To which I completely and immediately landed at Frederick Douglass's wife. And I was like, she loses if either of them lose, right? If Frederick Douglass wins, black men get everything. If Susan B. Anthony wins, white women get everything. And she still gets nothing, right? Like, unless they are both successful, she literally sits at the crux of that. And I think that that's where we as black women have sat for so long, right? We watched the feminist movement move forward with us in the background, heavily in the background. We've watched a lot of the black rights movements. I think of the civil rights movements and Mahalia Jackson and other women who were able to work alongside Martin Luther King, but were never able to speak alongside him because
Mm-hmm.
only the men got to speak. It's this very weird space that we've navigated for so long, of only allowing a certain part of our identity to be the one we speak for today. Today, I
Yeah.
could speak as a woman. Today, I'm here to speak as a black person, right? Very rarely do I get to speak as a black woman in a space. And hopefully that's changing. There's pockets of change that we see happening every day, but
Mm-hmm.
in general, it is kind of this other kind of code switching, this other kind of shape shifting, where we're deciding what part of our identity is the part that will move the needle of progress at this moment more. Will my woman voice speak louder than my blackness, or vice versa? And just things that I don't know that everyone has to deal with. Again, I don't know everyone's experience, and maybe this is something that queer white men deal with, of not knowing
Mm-hmm.
where to wrinkle, or that there is this space of understanding privilege that white men deal with, of not knowing when to execute their privilege and when to kind of play more side note. I
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how those experiences work because that's not my personal experience, but I know for me, it is this constant assessing of a situation. It's these eyes again, right? Of always having to scan and glean, and who do I need to be today in this moment? Oh, so and so entered the conversation. How does that shift
Hmm.
how I get to show up? Am I after ready to be quieter now? Am I after ready as a conversation shifts? Not to ramble, but um I was in another city that I can't name right now because it'll give away some other things. But I'm not allowed to talk about it. I was in another city and in the back of this Uber, and this woman was like, "Where are you guys from?" And we're like, from Texas, me and a friend of mine. And she's like, "How are things at the border?" And that question alone, I completely knew who I needed to be for the rest of that conversation,
Hmm.
right? That at this conversation was going to be someone who immediately felt like the border was a threat, that there was caravans of people infiltrating, right? That they're like, we got to save America from the Latins, right? Or no, not even Latins, the Mexicans, because everybody's a Mexican, right? Like, that's a thing, that there's not diversity in those stories. And looked at the black woman next to me and we were like, oh, okay. It's
Hmm.
good. Right. Immediately language shrunk. Immediately we knew the rules of how to show up. And then it literally went to gangs and shooting babies in the face. We don't know how it got there in 5 minutes, but that Uber driver felt like their comfort level, because we didn't push back, was a permission to then spout every racist thing that they had to say in a matter of a 5-minute ride from Target to our hotels. Um, by which we got out of the car, looked at each other, and went, "Girl," because that speaks everything for us, right? And was like, "What was that, and how, and why, sis? What's up?" But that immediate thing of knowing how to shapeshift.
Yeah.
Okay, new assessment, new world, got to show up. You know?
It's a question of, so this, I'm going to ask this next question on two levels. Number one, I want to use the term authenticity. And so in those moments, because I, of course, shapeshift. I was at a dinner last night where the friend I was sitting next to was like, "Who am I supposed to be tonight?" Like which arrow am I to draw from in my quiver, and how am I to show up? And so there's at minimum. I mean, I tell kids, you would know this because you worked in schools. I tell kids all the time, you got to be really clear what jokes to tell in one classroom and which jokes not to tell in the other classroom. So, how to navigate the complexity of a social system is something we all need to do on some level, except when that social system is trying to subjugate or quiet or silence you, versus just, I'm adaptive and I can navigate through several different territories, not, I need to figure out how I can kind of soothe the other so I'm not a threat. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious. This question is the how do you maintain authenticity and your vulnerability in your writing, especially when addressing these sensitive subjects? Like how does that show up in your written work?
Yeah, I mean, one, having a great editor is wonderful because I can say things very honestly. She's like, "Wait, wait, wait, I don't know."
Uh-huh. Yeah.
She did it at one point. She was like, there's a word you use, and while I completely agree with it, the way it will be perceived is this.
Mm.
Is that the perception you want? If it is, we'll leave it. If it's not, I think we should revisit it, because what will happen is it's going to be a hurdle for people to get to this other truth that you really want to get to.
Hmm.
So it's a matter of weighing which truth is the most important. Which
Again.
which portion of your authenticity is the most important to shine at this moment? In the world, I think it's much like a wardrobe. Where like all of us have spare clothes for sure,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the amount of spare clothes I have to carry with me and the amount of spare clothes that you might have to carry with me are not the same amount of luggage, right?
Mm.
Um, and it's about acknowledging, that I'm carrying a whole couple trunks with me everywhere I go to decide who do I need to put on today? And at the moment's notice, when a chill gets in the air, do I need to put a jacket on? Do I need to become something else? Do I need to complicate or uncomplicate myself? And that doesn't just go to living outside of blackness. That's even within blackness, right? I think,
Mm-hmm.
as certain black people who I know have certain beliefs come in, I'm changing even then within my own culture. And so it is this very layered understanding. And I think that I try to represent that in the work. One of my biggest things was to make sure that no woman in these stories was a monolith, right? And that none of them were flat and none of them were flawless, that everyone had complications and was a little problematic and also a little celebratory, like my mom sits at the center of this story. And I asked my editor, I was like, do you feel like my mom is a bad person? Because if that's how I'm representing her, I need to go back and edit,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's not how I want to talk about a woman that I deeply love. And as an adult, I now understand that my mom made decisions that I don't agree with, right? I'm very aware that she did things and the reasons why she did them, why they made sense to her, and why I will never do that, right? And I think that that's a level of growth, but it's also just a level of awareness as an adult and seeing my parents as not just these fantastical beings that raised me, but also these flawed humans that were trying their best to do everything they could, right? Like as a parent, that's what I am. I'm not perfect, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to try to be my best version of my flaws today for you, you know? Um, and so it was really about trying to celebrate all that wardrobe, right? Is to show you, here's my mom wearing a jacket, here's my mom wearing a dress, right? Here's my mom barefoot running through the snow. Like here's my mom butt naked, right? When she shouldn't be, right? Like this, there's everything. And I want you to see her as clearly as I do because I see all of these facets and I don't have to default to one.
Mm. Yeah, that question of thank you for that. The question about authenticity is interesting because at times we're unconscious of how we're showing up. And so if and I maybe this is too simplistic, but to consciously code switch with awareness and to unconsciously adapt and shift yourself, yet think that's you know, rather than those are choices that you're making in the clothing that you're wearing. There's something different about that, you know,
Yeah.
to be a magician who consciously shifts, and to be somebody who's insecure and wants to be liked, are not to those are the distinctions, but that's certainly a powerful dynamic.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, and a dynamic that doesn't sit one apart from the other, right? Like I would say that a lot of the code switching for survival is also steeped in wanting to be liked and
sure,
accepted and seen as equal, right? So, you know, it's muddy waters, you know?
right, totally. Yeah, no, I think that's wisdom.
Mhm.
So, what do you hope that people are going to get from reading your book? What do you want them to get?
So I've had this question asked.
I'm sure.
In some ways I don't know. In some ways I just want empathy, right? Like
Mm,
not sympathy. That's punk. I don't want that. I want you to really feel, right, feel like you can see us differently
yeah.
and that you can find something that you like, I connect with that in a way that I never thought that I would. And so I think that's like number one. I think number two, I want specifically Black women who read this book, which it's open to everyone. I want everyone to read it, but Black women who read this book to be able to see themselves, right, in a way that maybe another book has not been able to give them
Mm-hmm.
yet. Right, to like that's it. You know, Delita Martin, who did the cover of this book, who's brilliant.
Oh.
She said, I don't usually give my work over to projects like this, but reading this, I felt at home. And I
Oh.
don't know how you made me feel home in this book. I don't know how you took the ideas I was putting in artwork and put them into text in the exact same ways that I was seeing them. And we've never met each other and we've never talked, right? It's just there was something that was like almost in the zeitgeist of Black womanness that I tapped into that becomes so much bigger than just my own personal memory.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's a huge compliment, and also is the thing that I want people to take away. And then I think that I also want people to just have kind of their eyes open to look at the world differently. You know, to say that there's no story of any person of any race, ethnicity, social understanding that we can't look at with eyes that are open enough to at least evaluate their truths, even if we don't agree with them. Because I think that, especially at this moment in time, we're at a place where if we lose the inability to be compassionate, if we lose the ability to empathize, if we lose the ability to disagree, let's be honest, and to be challenged by other people's viewpoints, who we become as a society is so much less successful when we're just living in the bubble of expecting everyone to have our own understanding. Right, our diversity is what makes us beautiful. Our
Mm.
head bashing and clashing together is what makes us complicated and a mosaic of a sort. And so I really want people to lean into that and see that there are multiple stories out there that we may have never conceived of before that still shine light into making us better people and better citizens of the world.
Well, there's a disagreement that's held from beneath with curiosity, and there's a disagreement that's held together with rigidity.
Yeah.
And I mean, I want you to shape me. I want to have a say as a human being. I want to matter, and I want, when we come together, there's a kind of connection where we're intermingling and affecting each other. And if I open up and if I show up, I'll leave changed. It's like a moment like this for me is an alternate state of consciousness. We're totally connected here, and allowing the magic and the medicine to shape and transform us. And I gotta say, I'm looking right here, right now, at this amazing work of art. It's been staring at me, and Delita, I gotta say, this is gorgeous. And and for me, it's a real beautiful peek into some of the childhood dynamics of, the ways I didn't grow up, just as a man, and with different hair, and now no hair. Your stories on your hair, I was hooked. I was totally hooked into this drama and dynamic, and how important the narrative is about your hair in your childhood, and how much that, and of course why Medusa stands out, and the dreadlocks as this kind of point of identity. I mean, it was so beautiful to read that. Would you comment on that for a second? So I don't want to leave that hanging so anybody doesn't
No,
know what I'm talking
it
about.
was some of my funnest is not a
I
word. I'm gonna
I
say
could
it.
tell. Yeah,
Yeah. I
I
had a
could
lot of
totally
fun
tell.
writing that section.
Yeah,
It leans towards a lot of fantasy and a lot of speculative fiction. And also, there was these really traumatic moments of my life, like my hair falling out from getting a relaxer, right? That like is not really my story. It's the story of Black
yeah.
girls everywhere. And as I talk to my contemporaries, we're all like, "Yup, I know that smell." I'm getting ready to release a short film that I created from the book because I'm crazy and I can't stop
You're
doing
doing
projects.
so much. Holy moly.
I think I'm so proud.
No,
Um,
I totally relate. I love it. I can't wait to benefit from your work more. I already have.
yeah. So by the time this airs, the short film will already be up on my
Cool.
website, livelifedeep.com.
Then look below. I'll include the link in the
Yes,
show
please
notes.
do. So we created like a 2-minute video where we took some of the text from the book and turned it into a short film, and it's me
Ah,
doing my daughter's hair. And the what you don't see is the background, the B-roll, right, of my daughter seeing a hot comb for the first time, and she walks in and she looks at it and she's like, "Mom, what is this?" And I'm like, "It's a hot comb, babe." And she goes, "It looks like it's from 1876." And then I'm like, "Babe, no, it's not." She goes, "It's like a rat tail comb on the top and a hammer on the bottom." And she's just like having this moment, and I realized in that moment like that she grew up in a freedom that I didn't, right? Like that I know the smell of a hot comb by 4 years old, right? Like I knew exactly
mm-hmm.
what that smell was in the beauty shop. In my mom's house, I knew what that feel of like the hot comb hitting your scalp for just a minute before pulling out, right? Like just those visceral things live in my body and they have never had to live in hers because her hair has always been natural. She's always celebrated, and we've always done a really good job of saying, "This is how your hair goes out of your body. If you want to change it, that's your business, but like this is enough already."
Mm-hmm.
And so I think with things like the Crown Act coming in and talking about professionalism and about Black hair and how we show up as our authentic selves in society in a legal way, it only made sense to have a whole chapter dedicated to kind of this discovery of my own self and coming to being a woman who wears her hair naturally most of the time, 90% of the time. And also, this cataloging for my daughter that she now gets the freedom that she has to be herself, to
Mm.
wear her big pappus of brown, right? Everywhere she goes, because we've learned how to accept ourselves through these other really hard and difficult ways that we've tried to get out of being our authentic self.
Well, and that's the thing, is that I I might I might not have that in my narrative, but when I look at you and say, "Oh my gosh, this whole story is about a struggle for self-acceptance," and the cultural narratives of the patterns that women certainly go through with their hair, and how much narrative can be, how much you can encapsulate those dynamics in these narratives. And I felt that reading the section. I just loved it. I mean, it felt like I was getting a peek into your childhood home, but that I could say I was getting a peek into many childhood homes, in experiences that are foreign to me. And it was a beautiful glimpse into difference. And I just appreciated the opportunity to, because your words, your ability to speak is so solid. I just loved it. So anybody who's watching, please, this is well worth a read. And I'm again, I'm benefiting from how you show up.
Well,
Uh,
thank you.
so we got to start closing out, and I want to ask a couple questions that are, I want to, of course, know your influences, and I want to
Mhm.
know. So start there with influences, and then we'll start closing out.
Yeah, I'll say my most direct Octavia Butler, Toni Morrison. For this book, Audre Lorde, right? Zamia New Spelling of My Name was a biomythography where she taps into using mythology that she creates herself. And so there was a huge permissive moment when I found that because I was like, if Audre Lorde could do it, I could do it. That sounds amazing, right? So that was definitely there. I think also work of Inazaki Shange in For Color Girls, and the idea of choreo poem gave me freedom to bend form and to say, we can have a moment where she uses dance and poetry, but I can bend poetry to prose,
Mm,
and poetry and prose to myth.
mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
those like permissive forces definitely exist in this book.
So, and then of course, let us know what you've got coming up in the future, because it sounds like your dance card is full.
Yeah, I have a couple dance cards. So let's see, this will come out in okay. So May, let's talk May.
Good.
So in May, I have three productions that are going live. Yeah, I know y'all. May 4th, I'm actually going to be performing with Loop 38 at the Rothko Chapel in celebration of.
Whoa.
So that will be fun.
Beautiful. That's my one of my favorite places in the world.
Oh, because it's a beautiful space, right?
Yes.
In so many different ways. And then I believe May 12th, I want to make sure I'm getting that date right, but May 12th is the opening of Unearthed at the Wortham Theater with Decamera. And so that piece celebrates the Sugarland 95 and the struggle of the 95 bodies that were found in the recent dig in Fort Bend County. They were digging to create a school and found the bodies of a convict leasing program, 95 unidentified bodies that they've been struggling to figure out what to do with for the last few years. And so celebrating, the journey of what it is to be a person who comes out of enslavement and only finds themselves enslaved again as a
Mm-hmm.
convict. And the plight to kind of figure out what to do in heralding and remembering their lineage. That's definitely coming out. And then the May 31st in New York. So if you're in New York, I'll be launching my next new opera called She Who Dared, who's composed by Jasmine Barnes. She It centers around the 7 Black women who all shifted the Montgomery bus system, including Rosa Parks, but not limited to Rosa Parks. And talking about their dynamics, working in with each other as 7 wildly different women who all came together for one goal to change the system and to make their lives better for people beyond them. And so that piece will go up with the American Lyric Theater May 31st as a staged reading and hopefully a future production to come. And then I spend much of June on a European tour with my book. So I'll be in Austria, Germany, and Amsterdam, kind of just talking to collegiates and folks who want to come out and kind of check the book out and have conversations. So that's like the most recent things that are happening, yeah, in my life.
Yeah, yeah. I thought I was busy. Wow, Dave, you're an inspiration. You're a joy. I mean, I love reading your words. I love what you do. I love the role that you dig in socially. You've been a teacher of children. You've been a teacher of me. You've been a speaker to so many. And this book was a descent of all into all kinds of directions, from the tearful realization of what realities were beneath your initial story about the blinded children, to hair, and the way that your hair, to the comical way that your hair was jacked with
Yeah.
and formed and shaped. I can tell you, it is such a joy to connect with you. You're obviously a bright and shining star that's doing so much to contribute to this world. Thanks for that silver tongue of yours. I'm glad that it's never been directed at me to cut me apart.
No, you understand, all learning, all sharing has been reciprocitous. I've enjoyed every time I've got to share space with you and your wife, and the work that you do is so important. Mental health in general is something that we don't pay enough attention to. And so anytime I can give a way for people to express themselves or to tap into especially really harsh things that they don't know how to talk about, I'm always going to be on the side of figuring out how to express that.
And that's an important role you carry. Thank you.